leaders stay too long in office. And that certainly has been the case for a number of leaders. I'm sure that very few people can read this very small writing on my slide, but again, the meaning of it shouldn't be difficult to communicate. This is the list of the leaders that, as of mid-2018, had been in office in African countries between 1960 and 2018 for 20 years or more. And 20 years is already a pretty demanding threshold. You know, had we chosen a 15 years threshold, which is already a pretty long time to stay in office, we would probably have not 36, but maybe 50, 60 African leaders. So top of the list we have Omar Bongo of Gabon, who ruled the country between 1967 and 2009, when he died in office. Then number 3, we had the current longest serving ruler, Obiang of Equatorial Guinea. There we say 38 years and 331 days, but it's been more than 1 year since, so it must be 40 something. That has been there since 1979. We have a number of other names, Robert Mugabe, who exited office in 2017, Paul Biya in Cameroon. Some of these people are still in office. Al-Bashir there, it says in office, because this refers to last year, but of course he was ousted early this year. And down to the end of the list, where we have Leopold Senghor, who stayed a little more than 20 years in office, when he left voluntarily in 1980. So we do have a number of leaders that between 1960, that is the period we consider in our analysis is 1960 to 2018. 1960, which is normally considered the year of Africa, when a number of 17 African countries reached independence. So the question is there, that the number of leaders have been long in office. But that's only part of the story. The other side, we might say, of the story is that a number of leaders have been violently ousted from office. So instead of stability, we have had instability, frequently in the form of coup d'etat. There have been 90 coup d'etat between 1960 and 2018. 29 African countries, almost 2/3, suffered one or more coup d'etat. A number of coup d'etat occurred against former golpistas, ousted military rulers. If we look at the 45 African leaders who were in office at the time of independence between 1960 and 1970s, as many as 22 were ousted by coup d'etat. The founding leaders. 5 were murdered, 11 were arrested, 5 were exiled. This is a graph that gives you an idea of the trend in terms of coup d'etat, and I only give you the first half of the graph. I will later complete it with what happens after 1990. Between 1960 and 1990, I will stop here now. How should we look at this graph? For every year, sorry, just one, I should first tell you this. All these data are based on our data set. I will later come to the data set. For now, let me just point to the data that I'm showing in the slide. For every year, we count the number of leadership changes. And here you have, for example, in 1964, you have 5 leadership changes. The total amount represented in the column. In 1966, this should be, we have 9 leadership changes, meaning that there are 9 African countries where a leadership change takes place. And the part with the stripes is the one that represents coup d'etat. It's the share of leadership changes that occurs through coup d'etat. So for every year, you see that there's a significant share of coup d'etat. For some years, there's only leadership changes that take place through coup d'etat. There's a general trend in the increase, trend of an increase in terms of the share of coup d'etat as a share of all leadership changes. And this line represents the percentage, which we should read on the right-hand side, of leadership changes that take place through coup d'etat. For example, in this year, you see that 100% of the leadership changes, the only leadership change that takes place is via coup d'etat, so you have 100% of leadership changes taking place through coup d'etat. Here you have this significant share, it's probably 2 out of 3, and here you have a 66% percentage of leadership changes taking place through coup d'etat. So the simple message is there was a significant part of changes in leadership that took place via coup d'etat. To make a long story short, between the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s, we had these two political syndromes that were apparently contradictory, two opposite syndromes. On the one hand, you had long-serving rulers, those rulers that overstayed in power, using the words of Mussolini. And on the other hand, you had this very high frequency of coup d'etat. Coup d'etat became less and less frequent in other areas of the world. Africa remained an area where coup d'etat were pretty frequent. So overstaying power and chronic political instability. But are they actually two entirely different political syndromes? Or do they have something in common? I think they do have something in common. What they do have in common is that they are a manifestation of the lack of regularized procedures for replacing leaders. You have no regular ways, mechanisms to replace political leaders. So either they stay in office or you oust them violently. And one may argue, we actually argue, that the absence of this kind of mechanisms imply a lack of accountability. You cannot hold leaders that are in office accountable. The people cannot hold leaders accountable. And this probably contributed to a negative impact on government performances. If I am ruling and I'm not held accountable, why should I strive, make an effort to produce economic growth or to improve the welfare of my people? You know, my remaining in power does not depend on the results I achieve. It depends on something else. I have to be very good at managing my political relationships within the elite. But I don't have to pay a lot of attention to the needs of the population, to the progress in terms of development, because there is not a moment, such as an electoral moment, when I will be held accountable and people will tell me, no, you've not been good enough, please move aside and let somebody else rule our country. And it's, there result, as I said, was a period when economic growth in the region deteriorated gradually. Of course, I'm generalizing. All of what I'm saying today is going to be a general argument about the sub-Saharan region, which is made of 49 countries, and trajectories have not been all the same, of course. So what I'm talking about is the average trend for the region. And economic growth in this first 3 decades, the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, gradually deteriorated. Initially, higher growth rates were achieved, but they slowed down. And the 1980s was a very bad decade for the region as a whole in terms of economic growth. So from our point of view, political leadership arguably contributed to this. As I just said, there were overstaying leaders, there were leaders that were ousted from office violently. Either way, these were not leaders that were held accountable for what they did, and thus paid limited attention to the development results of their countries. And this did not help economic growth and other development achievement. So here, of course, you have GDP growth rates for the region, sub-Saharan region, year by year, and you see them gradually declining. This is the trend. The dotted line indicates the trend. But what happens in the 1990s? As you know, in the early 1990s, sub-Saharan Africa embraced multi-party politics. This was the post-1989 world. So on the global scene, important changes were taking place. But in Africa specifically, between 1990 and 1995, 1996, dozens of sub-Saharan countries adopted multi-party elections in situations where previously they were mostly ruled by either military regimes or one-party states. These were replaced by multi-party politics. And one reason why they were replaced is that from African societies emerged a demand for change. We may interpret this as a reaction to the deterioration of the development scenario that I just summed up with the previous slide. So people were saying, stop, please, let's move on. Let's change these political setups that are not working. We need to introduce mechanisms, institutional arrangements that help us govern our societies in a better way. So the introduction of multi-party politics was the response to a demand for getting rid of bad leadership and introducing some kind of mechanism to keep an eye on leaders and hold them accountable. The rationale, the reason, the motivation behind it was that development performance would improve. And the development trajectories of African countries would be redressed with the help of these kind of mechanisms. In fact, the early pressures for political change in most African countries did not so much emerge as a demand for democracy, partly as a demand for democracy, for political freedom and for political equality. But to a significant extent, these were demands for some kind of change, for moving beyond the disappointing results that had been achieved in the 1980s. In practice, we do know that elections in many African countries did not amount to democratic politics. Multi-party elections were introduced, but in many countries these were somehow controlled by those in power to make sure that they would remain in office. In some countries, democratic progress was achieved, in many others it was not. But still, even in those countries where that made little progress in terms of democratic politics, for example, because there was no freedom of information, because civil society was strongly controlled, because electoral processes were controlled, electoral processes and outcomes. Even in those countries, there was a change, there was a move to multi-party politics. Elections now allowed opposition parties in most places to run for office, at least formally. So based on this description, very general description of some general trends in sub-Saharan Africa, what are our research questions? The research questions that drove our research. First, did multi-party elections actually modify the dynamics of leadership or leadership changes in Africa, the modes, the way leaders achieve office, reach office, and the timing of their reaching office? And secondly, was there an impact in terms of development outcomes? Was there some kind of improvement in terms of development results? Let me start by making a few remarks concerning the relationship between political leadership and development. And then I will go back to the question of what we see happening in African countries. As weird as this may appear, political leadership has not been a key issue in contemporary political science. Or better, it's not been widely studied in political science, in mainstream political science. It is one of the themes that was explored by early political thinkers, such as Machiavelli or Weber. But contemporary political science did not pay a lot of attention to political leadership as a key issue. And by contemporary political science, I mean political science that begins in the 1950s and on. The predominant approach was one that emphasized structural forces, not so much the role of individuals. So not so much a perspective that emphasized what great men could do, what individuals could do. The kind of perspective that we've seen on the cover of The Economist. These men can do a lot. That was not the predominant perspective in political science. Great man theories is a label that is typically used for, that was used by some historians in the 19th century that focus on the key role of some individuals in driving history, in making history, in directing the development trajectories of their countries. But as I said, in political science, the predominant approach was different, and that emphasized, adopted a perspective that we might call leaders do not matter. What counts is structural forces. It's modernization process, it's economic change, it's demographic trends, not things that a single individual can affect. History is made by these structural forces. Political leadership in mainstream political science was largely studied in terms of biographic narratives. There's a lot of studies of individual American presidents, for example, Roosevelt, Kennedy, Nixon, or British Prime Ministers, Churchill, Margaret Thatcher, or French presidents, Mitterrand, or whoever else. I'm talking here mostly of Western leaders because mainstream political science largely focused on Western countries. And there was little theorization about the role of leadership. So there were biographic narratives, meaning that these studies illustrated the personal and political life of these individuals. But they did not engage into theorizing in terms of an hypothesis, a cause, a consequence, as much of political science normally does. And most of all, political leaders were hardly ever emphasized as an explanatory factor. They were hardly ever used to explain something. Political leadership as an explanation for war, for development, for domestic conflict. No, this was hardly ever the case. Political leaders at the most were seen something to be explained, as something to be explained. What explained the rise of Franklin Delano Roosevelt or Margaret Thatcher? So not as a cause, but as an effect. Africa, from this point of view, was somewhat different. Political leadership has been central to the study of African politics from its early days. The founding fathers, in the context of relatively weak institutions, catalyzed the attention of many scholars. The Kwame Nkrumah, Julius Nyerere, or Keita, Toure, or Kenyatta, they were the focus of so much attention. They appeared to embody the independence of their countries and the trajectory of their country. There was also some theory with regard to what political leaders did. But most of this theory was focused on the politics surrounding political leaders. For example, the most relevant approach was the one which is normally labeled personal rulers. The one developed by Ali Mazrui or Jackson or Roseberg. And here the emphasis was on the personalization of power in the hands of these powerful figures. Again, think of Kenyatta, of Senghor, in Senegal, of Houphouët-Boigny in the Ivory Coast, and very many others, trying to understand the extent to which they concentrated power in their hands, the extent to which power was personalized, as opposed to following formal procedures and institutionalization. It was very much personal, which allowed them to use clientelistic distributions. And the key focus was on the survival of leaders. So those who studied leadership in African countries mostly focused on the dynamics that allowed leaders to stay in power, how they could handle their relationships with the rest of the elite. Mostly. But the key concern, the key focus was political survival, not so much their impact on development, on the development of the country at large. It was hardly ever employed as an explanatory factor for development. So let me now move more clearly to the leadership development nexus. If we look at economic explanations of development, so the work of economists, I'm now moving from political science to economic studies in economics. Leadership, again, is hardly ever employed as a key factor. Economists like to focus on issues such as the level of development, explaining the GDP growth rates, or the level of investments, or the level of government spending, or other factors such as demographics. But political leadership is hardly there as an explanation of development, with very few exceptions. And yet again, as I said from the very beginning, the assumption is often there. It's not part of the studies, but the assumption is very generally made that leaders do actually matter for development. This is an extract from an essay by Jean Blondel, an essay on political leadership, which says, well, if the power of leaders can be exercised to control, dominate, and subjugate, it can surely also be exercised to uplift, improve, and develop. It is essential to assess how far and under what conditions leaders can modify the society they rule. And that's our starting point. So now I'm moving back to our project on political leadership in Africa, and in a moment I will show you the data set we built. Our project is based on the assumption that leadership can be an important causal factor for development. By leadership, I haven't said this so far, we mean the single individual that occupies the top decision-making position in a country's political institutional setup. In your country, this would be the Prime Minister. But there's very few parliamentary systems in Africa. In most countries, this would be the President. So it's one individual. Not everybody looks at political leadership this way. Some studies look at political leadership in terms of, in broader terms, look at the political elites. But we focus on individuals, whether rightly or wrongly. That's our focus. Also, we pay a lot of attention to the institutional setup. So for us, it is important the institutional context in which somebody takes office. For example, here in Ethiopia, I don't want to speak about Ethiopia. I'm not a specialist. No, it's not that I don't feel free. It's just that I'm not a specialist of Ethiopia. So, but let's think of South Africa, for example. South Africa, despite the fact that Cyril Ramaphosa is the president, is one of those few countries that adopts a parliamentary system. There is no direct presidential election. He's called president, not prime minister, but he's elected by parliament. Okay, there is only one election for parliament, and then it's parliament that decides who the president is. But he cumulates the role of president of the republic and prime minister de facto, though he's not called prime minister, but president. For us, it is important how he reaches power. So the South African president is somebody who gets there via an election, a multi-party election, that's key. And also we look at the extent to which these elections are democratic or not. We will come back to this. Because we found a huge gap in terms of the data that we needed, we had to build a data set. So essentially, we wanted to study the role of leadership in African countries between 1960 and 2018. We wanted to understand whether we were right or wrong in thinking that leaders can have an impact, and certain leaders more than other leaders. we needed the data for all the countries for every year, for all the leaders. But the data was not there. We worked very hard for a very long time in building this data set. And we called it the African Leadership Change Data. And then our last step was to focus on the impact of these leaders. So we had to gather the data on leaders, and then put this data together with data on development outcomes achieved under this or that leadership, and try to understand whether there was a connection. Was a military leader normally worse than an elected leader? So this is the kind of reasoning that we wanted, that we built upon. Do you have any questions? Am I being clear enough? If you want to raise your hand and interrupt me, please feel free to do that. Okay, so these are my next 3 steps. First, I will describe now the African Leadership Change Dataset. Secondly, I will describe African leadership dynamics in terms of the data we gathered. So we gathered all this data, and then we use them, first of all, to offer a picture of the main trends in African leadership. So how did African leaders change over time? And separately, and third point, I will show you our findings in terms of the impact of African leaders on development outcomes. First of all, the African Leadership Change Dataset. How many of you are familiar with the notion of dataset? Please raise your hands. Okay, few people. A dataset is simply a collection of data, which is systematically organized. And as I said, it can be very, very easy to download if you just go to the World Bank data bank and want to get the data, for example, for life expectancy in African countries. In 3 minutes, you can do that. You get all the data from 1960 to today for every single African country concerning life expectancy or GDP growth rates and so on. These are data that have been collected, in this case, for example, by the World Bank, based on the information that every country provides or some other way, and then these data are collected by the World Bank or by UNDP or the IMF or the organization of the International Organization of Migration, whatever organization specializes on an issue, typically now tries to put together the key data sets on the issues that it covers, that it specializes on. There is no international organization for leadership that gathers data really from there, but I'll try and explain it. You have all African countries listed 59 times, actually 60 now. From 1960, so it's Benin, it starts from 1960, then 1961, 62, and so on and so forth, 1966, 67. For every year, you have the leader. You have a number of variables of data that we want to record for that specific country in that year. Our focus is on the leader that is in power at a certain point. So you have here Mathieu Kérékou, the leader who was in office in Benin since 1996. And then the subsequent leader who got to power, Yahya Boni, and then Patrice Talon, up to the current year, 2019. This is the last update. But of course, it's not just the the name of the leaders, which is a work in itself to get all the names of all the leaders for all these years. In the subsequent columns, we look at the number of aspects. Key among them is how they reached office. So all these columns with all these little numbers tell you, for example, whether there was a multi-party election. This year in Benin, this was 2011, there was a multi-party election. 0 and 1 are used as yes or no. 0 is no, 1 is yes. So you have a multi-party election here, a multi-party election here, a multi-party election there. So we have all the years when you had a multi-party election. Then you have, for example, data concerning election result. Here, this one here tells you the result of the election in terms of the incumbent winning the election, as opposed to an opposition candidate. And then I can move on this side, and we have dozens of other variables. For example, we had coup d'etat or guerrilla takeovers. We had the share of votes that the ruling party gets. We had dozens of variables. And at some point, we conclude with the political variables and we add other variables. Economic growth rates, for example, for Benin 2013, far away, somewhere here, you would have a column that gives you the growth rate of that country for that year. So very roughly, this is what a data set looks like. It's a massive effort putting together this data. So let me go back to, and why did we do that? Because we wanted our work to be very systematic. We wanted to be able to say something general, broad about the region, about the general trends in the region. So we did it with statistics, and we'll see a little bit of that at the end. But before that, we had to build this, because it was not there. Nobody had done that before. Our leadership chain dataset includes all 360 leaders that have been in office in African countries since independence. So you may want to count how many leaders your country had. Think about the countries. Some countries had, a large number of leaders, maybe 14, 15 leaders since 1960 and today. Others, think of Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe only had 2 leaders, Mugabe and Mnangagwa. I can never get that right. South Sudan only had 1 leader so far. Eritrea only had 1 leader so far. Of course, these are more recently created countries, so it's easy to understand. Well, it's easy. They are a little bit more likely to have 1 leader only. Other countries had several leaders. 360 leaders in all. 49 countries, that is, we cover, our study focuses on sub-Saharan countries, which are 49. Our data set, you might have seen, also includes the North African countries, Algeria, Tunisia, Egypt, Morocco, and Libya, but our study does not focus on that. We only include it in the data set. The period that we cover is 1962 to 2018. We have 2,575 country year observations, meaning 2,500 lines in that data set that are compiled for all the variables that I exemplified. Over 100 variables, political variables, economic and social variables. Our focus is on leadership change. You clearly understood that by now, but we also include a number of other variables. For example, we had variables with the birth and death dates of the leaders, with election results, with the presence of term limits. You're not familiar with this in this country because you have a parliamentary system. So as in Italy or in Germany, you don't have term limits for the prime minister, because parliamentary systems never have them, except for South Africa and Botswana. But presidential systems where presidents are directly elected very often have the limit of 2 presidential mandates. But not always, almost always, but not always. So we also record that in our data set. The key parties and their election results, the regime, whether according to international assessments of the degree of democracy, a country in a given year is deemed democratic or not. We have that information for every single year. The form of government, parliamentary or presidential. The sub-region a country belongs to, East Africa, West Africa, Southern Africa, to understand whether some trends are specific to certain sub-regions. And then the colonial legacy, to understand whether there's an impact of that, and so on. Nobody told me how much I should go on talking. We have time until 20 minutes. I'm never going to make that, but I'll try. How is this data set built? As I say, our focus is on leadership change. So, first of all, we identify every single time a new leader comes to office. Remember Benin? When Yahya Boni got to power and replaced Kérékou. I'm not sure, maybe it was 2006. So we have a leadership change there. For that, we want to understand what kind of leadership change it was. Whether it was a non-electoral leadership change or an electoral leadership change. Down here, we have the non-electoral path to leadership change. And up there, you have the electoral way to leadership change. Let's first look at this part. Non-electoral changes are peaceful changes, such as the one you had here last year. Did you have an election last year? You didn't. But you replaced your leader through some other processes. Your prime minister, your outgoing prime minister said, well, we need a change. He resigned, and then a process got started whereby a new leader was elected. This was a peaceful handover of power from one prime minister to the other one, without an election specifically taking place at that time. This is very typical of parliamentary systems. Presidential systems normally rely on the election, the time of an election, to replace one leader with another one. Peaceful change, you may have the natural death of a leader. You unfortunately also witnessed that in 2012. Or resignation of the incumbent leader. On the other hand, you may have, again, a non-electoral change in the leadership through violence. And here, you also experienced a coup d'etat very many years ago. And you also experienced a guerrilla takeover, also many years ago. So you've tried all ways of changing your leaders. You're very experienced. You should actually be here talking about leadership changes, not me. So those are the main ways in which you can have a leadership handover that does not take place through an election. On the other side, we have leadership changes that occur through an election. Now, why here and not here? Because what we are interested in is this part, and of course, again, you won't be able to read this, but I'll try and sum it up. But to have an electoral change before, you need a multi-party election. Okay, you have an electoral change where you have an election, and this election for the executive might actually end up in no leadership change where the incumbent wins the election. Okay? For example, in South Africa, we said earlier this year, they had an election, but Ramaphosa was the president already. He had replaced Jacob Zuma a couple of years before the election, 1-2 years before the election. So you have multi-party election, you may have the incumbent that wins the election, or you may have an electoral change. A leader that was not elected. For example, in Zambia in 1991, Zambia held its first multi-party election in 1991. The country had been ruled by Kenneth Kaunda for some 30 years. He ran for office at that time. He was not an elected leader. Let me be clear about this. By elected leader, we mean somebody who went through a multi-party election. So he had been elected to a one-party election, which we do not consider, and we do not label as an elected leader. So he was an unelected leader who approached a multi-party election, and he was ousted by voters. He was replaced by Chiluba. Or the same goes for Hastings Banda in Malawi. He had ruled Malawi for some 30 years, from the 60s up until 1994. In 1994, he introduces multi-party elections, but he loses. So a new leader takes office. Okay? And when a leader that was not elected loses power or is no longer in power, we may have an electoral succession where the new leader comes from the same party of the outgoing leader, or an electoral alternation when the new leader is a candidate from the opposition. In the case of Zambia and Malawi, we had these electoral alternations. In the case of Tanzania, we had an electoral succession. Mkapa, he was elected in 1995. But in the context of TANU, ruling party continuity. On the lower half of our data set, of the structure of our data set, we consider cases where we have an electoral change and the outgoing leader was elected. He was already a leader who was in power thanks to multi-party elections. And again, here you have successions and alternation. You have a succession when the new leader that reaches power comes from the same party as the outgoing leader. Think, for example, of Mozambique. In Mozambique, you had Joaquim Chissano, who was originally an unelected leader. In 1994, he was elected because Mozambique also introduced multi-party elections. He ruled the country for 2 mandates, 94 to 99 and 99 to 2004. In 2004, he was replaced by Armando Guebuza, a candidate from the Frelimo party, from the same political party. So we had a succession. Okay, the leader comes from the same party. And Guebuza was replaced in 2014 by Filipe Nyusi. Again, a candidate from the same party. So this is a succession. On the other hand, we have electoral alternations, as I said, where you have an elected leader that is replaced by a candidate coming from the opposition. I refer to Nigeria 2015, but you may think of, for example, Kenya. Kenya had Mwai Kibaki, and then Uhuru Kenyatta. They all came from the opposition. Or you have Ghana, where when Rawlings stepped down, you had the opposition, John Kufuor, won office in 2000. And then again, you had other opposition candidates in subsequent elections. So this is to, I guess it's very complicated because it's pretty complex, the structure of the data set, but this is to familiarize a little bit with our approach. So the reasoning is, we identify a leadership change for each country, and then we have to classify what kind of leadership change exactly that was. Why is that? Because we want to understand whether getting to power one way or another does make a difference. Whether somebody who comes to power through a coup d'etat who's better or worse than somebody who gets elected. Whether somebody who gets elected who's better or worse if he's a leader coming from the ruling party, or if he's somebody coming from the opposition party. This I've already shown you. This is a screenshot of the data set for Nigeria. And again, now with insight, you see all the years of Nigeria, 1999. It starts from 1960, but here you only have 1989 to 2019. You have all the cases of leadership change where you have a change in the name of the leader. You have a yes, number one, in this column. So number one, number one, number one, every time a new leader comes to office. And then you have all these variables that tells you whether it was a peaceful non-electoral change, the one we just described, whether it was a multi-party election, whether it was a coup here. You don't have coup after 19... Yes, you have, sorry. You had the Sani Abacha coup, number one here, in 1993. So again, to give you a broad idea of how the dataset was built. One might ask me, why didn't you just use the dataset on democracy? They are well established, they are available from Freedom House, the best known one, from the Economist Democracy Index, or there's a dataset that is very widely used that is called Polity2. It's the one that I'm using here. And all these datasets tell you how democratic a country is. They have their own range of points they assign to each country, say from 0 to 10. 0 is not very much democratic, 10 is very democratic. And for every year they will be able to tell you how much Ghana, Ethiopia, Tanzania, or Benin is democratic. Why, Giovanni, why didn't you use that? We did use that partly, but what we wanted to learn about political leaders is not there in those datasets. For example, if you consider the Polity2 scale, here you have a scale that goes from -10 to +10. +10 is for countries that are deemed democratic, -10 is for countries that are not doing very well in terms of democracy. And these cases that you cannot see are leadership changes that occur in a number of countries through alternation or successions. So electoral changes, the ones I've just talked to you about. And one might expect these electoral changes only to occur in in countries that are pretty much democratic. But this is not the case. We see that a number of changes in power through elections occur at low levels of democracy, in the bottom half of this slide. I cannot go into details, but essentially you can see that, for example, Mauritania in 2009 or Tanzania in 1995, Angola in 2017. You had a leadership change, Dos Santos to Lorenzo, but the country is deemed not democratic at all. In Gambia, do you remember the Gambia, when Jammeh was defeated, surprisingly defeated at the election? This was one of the harshest regimes in the region. Nobody would have expected Jammeh to give way to an opposition victory. And he actually tried to hold on to power at some point. But he organized an election, because non-democratic countries in Africa do organize elections typically. But that time he was not able to control the results, and he got ousted. So we have a situation of a non-democratic country witnessing an alternation in power, the most surprising case, an opposition that wins office in a country which is very authoritarian. So that's why we could not use simply democratic measures, the measures of democracy, because we want to look at things that are that occur at different levels of democracy. So there's a partial overlap between what we do and what democracy measures tell us. Also, this is a bit again very much specific. There were some leadership datasets available. There's a couple of datasets focusing specifically on leaders. But again, these datasets were not fine-grained enough for us. The best known dataset is called the Archegos dataset. Essentially, somebody else gathered data on leaders, not only in Africa. The Archegos is not focused on Africa, but on all leaders across the world. But uses a way, classifies leaders in a way that is not useful for us. They use, for example, the expression regular entry into power to classify cases that for us are very different. If you look at Archegos, for example, you have all these African cases which they classify as regular entry into power, which for us are very different. If we unpack them, or if we divide these cases into our categories, so that the cases are the same, but here is our classification. This is Archegos. Archegos says regular entry. We say, no, these are different. We have non-electoral changes, for example, in Ethiopia or in Angola. We have electoral changes in terms of succession. We have electoral changes in terms of alternation, and so on. So we could not use that. Leadership changes in structure. Now, in two steps, I will first tell you the general trends, general picture that emerged in terms of how leadership dynamics have changed. And then the impact on development. Broadly speaking, we should keep in mind that there is a distinction between the first, where leaders were mostly not chosen through multi-party election, except for few countries, some issues, and few periods in other countries, 2-3 years. Nigeria, Ghana, Uganda, and then from the 90s on, that's the multi-party era, period, when leaders have been mostly elected through multi-party elections. And this is exactly the message of this first slide. Here you have the sheer increase in multi-party elections for the executive starting in 1990s. It's very clear, it's a watershed. Informally at least, it's completely different from what was there before. what you have here is the number of multi-party elections, that is, elections where two or more parties compete for power. So elections where one party only could present its candidates are excluded. Many countries had single-party elections. And also, do consider that here we only include elections for the executive. What do we mean? In a country such as Ethiopia, the election is for parliament, but it's the election through which the executive is supposed to emerge or be confirmed in office, because the prime minister is chosen by parliament. In presidential systems, what we have here is only presidential elections, so legislative elections, okay? And it's very clear that from 1990 on, every year you have a much larger number of elections taking place. At times even 12, 14, 16 elections in a single year, meaning 12, 14 countries going to the polls in that specific year. So that's our starting point. Leadership changes become more common. The trend is reversed. This is the annual frequency of leadership changes, so it's 8%, 10% of African countries, or around this, 6%, 12%, 14% is the way you should read it. For every decade, this was the average number of countries that annually changed their leader. Let's leave out this line that excludes interim leaders. If you look at the continuous line, you can see that the trend was declining, meaning that decade after decade, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, you had a declining frequency of countries that changed their leaders. It was less and less common to witness a leadership handover. From the 90s on, when you have those elections that I showed you in the previous slide, leadership changes increase, meaning it's more frequent to see a change at the top. And it's very clear how the decline was reversed. The length of stay in office also changed. What you have here is year by year, from 1960 to 2018, for every year, the duration, the average tenure in office of the leaders that in that year were in power. So in 1960, 61, and so on, leaders had been in power for these many years. And the trend is for leaders across the region, on average, being in power for longer periods up until the 80s. You can see the peak up there. This means that, say for example, in the mid-70s, the African rulers had on average been in power 8 years. So if you take 1974, if you look at all leaders, how long each of them has been in power, one of them 3 years, one of them 15 years, and so on, and you average them, it was 8 years, and then this goes up to almost 12 years in the late 80s, and then you have this drop, which is caused by the introduction of multi-party elections. So in the early 90s, you introduced African countries introduced multi-party elections, and there was a general renewal of leadership. Of course, this was not for all countries. Take, for example, Cameroon. Paul Biya is still there. He was there before and is there again. Mozambique, Joaquim Chissano was there before the 90s and was there after the election of 1994. But this decline is caused by the fact that some leaders are ousted. For example, we mentioned Kaunda or Hastings Banda, or, for example, Houphouët-Boigny actually died at the time. So long-lasting rulers are less common, but the tenure on average declines to 8 years, and then it grows up again until the very last few years when you had two long-lasting rulers exiting office, Dos Santos and Mugabe, causing another decline. if we separate the leaders who took office between 1960 and 1989, this would include, for example, Museveni. He's still in power, but he reached power in 1986. And you separate them from leaders who took power after 1990, the average stay in office is 9.5 years, whereas leaders who got to power after the introduction of multi-party elections, on average, have been in power for slightly less than 5 years. The standard deviation, the deviation means how far from the average leadership can be. So if the average is 9.5, are there many leaders that have actually been there for 25 or 30 years? Here we have a high standard deviation, meaning that for people who took power between 1960 and 1989, there were many that actually stayed there much longer, and others that stayed there very brief spells. For leaders who took power after 1990, the standard deviation is smaller, meaning that it's more regular to have leaders who stay, let's put it this way, a reasonable amount of time in office. Although I don't know exactly what reasonable amount of time would mean. Again, compare 1960s to the 1980s with the subsequent period, the multi-party period. These are all the leadership changes. 131 leadership changes taking place in the first 30 years, and 180 leadership changes taking place in the subsequent 30 years. And coup represented 48% of leadership changes in the first period. They went down to less than 20% in the second period. Peaceful, non-electoral changes were also a significant way of handing over power in the first period, and they also went down, although they remain significant. But what we see, most importantly, is the growth of electoral changes. So almost half of all leadership changes after 1990 take place through elections. So the modes of handing over power change. Coups went down and elections went up. This is, you remember the graph that I showed you before on coup at the beginning, and I said I will only show you up until 1990 before. Now this is the same graph completed with the second part of the period we examined after 1990, and you may remember that all these columns indicate the number of leadership changes we had every year, 1963, 64, 65, and so on. And the part with the stripes is the part that represents coup d'etat. And as you can see, coup d'etat are significant up until a certain point, and then they decline. They represent a residual part, a minor part of leadership changes. And while here you have coup d'etat essentially every year, here you have many years where you don't have coup d'etat at all. So they have become much less common. The Sudanese coup this year was relatively an anomaly for recent times. You may want to ask, okay, we do have more frequent elections, which we showed. We do have more frequent electoral changes, meaning a new leader that comes to the presidency or the prime ministership through elections. But how often is it the case that we have somebody from the opposition that gains power? Here we have, I'm sorry, there is no legend there, but essentially we have 3 columns for every decade, 2011 to 2018, 2001 to 2010, the 90s, and so on. The first column represents the number of elections where the incumbent wins. And it's always pretty substantial. The second column represents the number of electoral successions. remember what electoral successions are. When you have a new president that belongs to the same ruling party. And the third column represents electoral alternations, the number of victories for opposition candidates. And they're far from insignificant. Both electoral successions, here, here, and here, and electoral alternations, here, here, and here. And keep in mind that this stops at mid-2018, so there is still 2019 and 2020 to be added to help this column grow. So electoral alternations have become increasingly common. It's not true that sometimes they say that elections are only to confirm in power those who control the electoral processes, those who already rule the country. It does happen that oppositions win office in Africa. And to conclude this picture of leadership dynamics, before I move to say something about the development impact of leaders, we decided to create a new typology of African leaders. Back in the 1980s, scholars that talked about personal rulers contributed an influential typology, Jackson and Roseberg, that distinguished among leaders that were labeled prophets, the ideological leaders such as Kwame Nkrumah or Nyerere, tyrants such as Idi Amin or Bokassa, autocrats, and what was the last category? I can't remember right now, and the fourth category. We thought that that kind of labeling of African leaders is no longer helpful today, because things have changed. And so we decided to work on a new typology, and we opted for these three criteria. The first thing we ask is something that I haven't mentioned so far, but is how long has a leader been in power? At least 1 year, or was it just an interim, a transient experience? So we classify as transients or interim leaders all those that do not stay in power for more than 1 year. We want to set them aside. This is important for us because if you think in terms of the development impact of a leader, somebody who's been ruling the country for, say, 3 months, 2 weeks, 8 months, it's very difficult to think that it can have a strong impact on the development trajectory of a country. So we label them transients, and this is our first category. Secondly, we ask for all those that remain, having set aside transients, does the leader have a multi-party electoral legitimacy for most of his or her time in office, meaning has he been elected? If he has not been elected, for example, Isaias in Eritrea, he doesn't have an electoral mandate. Or Salva Kiir in South Sudan, he doesn't have an electoral mandate. So we label them autocrats. Having set aside transients and having set aside autocrats, we then ask, does the actual rule in that country meet democratic standards? Or put it differently, if we look at democracy measures, is that a country where this guy has been elected considered a democratic country or not? For example, Lourenço has been elected in Angola, but Angola is not considered a democratic country. So to us, he's a hegemon. Somebody who rules a country not exactly with complete control, but with hegemonic control. There are multi-party elections. He does have an electoral mandate, but the country is not deemed democratic. It's not a democratic electoral mandate. If it does have an electoral mandate in a country that is considered democratic, we label these people Democrats. And so these are our four categories: interim or transient leaders, autocrats, hegemons, and democrats. How numerous are their numbers for each of these categories? Try and guess.
The second category.
Second category. You expect autocrats to be the largest, to take the largest share in the history of independent Africa. What about today? Do you expect autocrats to still be the largest group today? Meaning leaders who do not have an electoral mandate, not even a controlled electoral mandate, because in that case we would consider them hegemons. Do you think autocrats have been on the increase or on the decrease?
That's the decrease.
On the
That's the decrease.
decrease. How many transients, interim leaders, do you expect to be there? Very numerous or not? No. You remember we said, we classified 360 leaders, and these are the numbers: transients, autocrats, hegemons, and democrats. Overall, the number of leaders. Transients are not insignificant in terms of as a group. 92 leaders held power for less than 1 year across sub-Saharan Africa. So they represent 25.5% of the overall number of leaders. Autocrats are the largest group. You were right. 33%, 119. Hegemons. Remember, hegemons are those that are elected under non-democratic conditions, are 65, or slightly less than 1 in 5. Democrats are 84, those that have been elected under reasonably democratic conditions, 23.4%. What is interesting here is to look at the number of country years that have been in office. Do you remember when I showed you the data set? All those lines. Benin 1960, Benin 1961, Benin 1962, up until Benin 2018. There's 2,577 lines in that data set. Most of the time is taken up by autocrats. So, autocrats represent by far the largest share of country years in sub-Saharan African countries. Transients, on the other hand, are pretty numerous in terms of absolute number, 92 as opposed to 119, but they only rule for a very short period of time. By definition, interim leaders only stayed on for short periods. And then you have data for hegemons and democrats. Also, the average duration in office, 0.3 years for interim leaders, 11 years for autocrats, 6.2 years for democrats. Lastly, this is the overall trend. If we use our criteria, you have autocrats, this red share of all leaders. This is essentially the number of leaders every year. Now, every year, leaders are classified as autocrats, hegemons, democrats, or transients. The number of countries that gain independence grows, so you see a larger number of leaders. And you see autocrats taking the largest share, especially up until the 90s, and then declining, very clearly declining, to leave room to the leaders that rule Africa under multi-party politics, either under non-democratic conditions, this gray area, these are so-called hegemons, or under more democratic conditions, satisfying basic democratic standards. And these are Democrats. They today represent the largest share. I think out of 49, it's about 23, 25, I can't remember the exact number, as against a similar but slightly lower number, say 21, 22 autocrats as of 2018. Tired. Yeah, he must be tired. But I'm there. Now, the last step, I said how we structured our data set. What I've just showed you is an overview of leadership dynamics, the increase of elections, of electoral changes in leadership, the downward trend in coup, the increase of so-called Democrats. This was just a description of how the ways leaders reach office have changed over the past 30 years in particular. And now I conclude with the impact on development. The question, the so what question. Does that make a difference in terms of development impact? So what are the development implications of the new leadership dynamics? Our starting assumption is that, in a sense, there is no such thing as a leader who has an interest, a personal interest in the development of a country, but the key interest is in maximizing tenure. The trouble is, under certain political institutional settings, you maximize tenure by producing development. You have incentives that modify your behavior. If you want to be elected and you want to be re-elected, you have to behave in a certain way, and this will favor a positive performance in terms of government achievements and development achievements. This is our starting assumption. In particular, if you are ruling a country under multi-party conditions, there is an increased possibility that you might lose office, that you are held accountable at election time, that somebody might challenge you and you will lose office, which you do not want as a leader. So there is more room for accountability, however limited. It tends to grow compared to situations where you don't have these institutional incentives offered by elections. And these accountability mechanisms tend to produce pressures for leaders to enhance government performances, and also for voters to become aware that they can change their leaderships or exert pressure on their leaders. Leaders, in other words, are more incentivized to provide something to society. I will not go into that, but essentially provide some kind of public goods, infrastructural development, economic growth, welfare improvements, as opposed to just thinking about how to distribute money or favors to remain in power, or distribute money, favors, or something else to a small clique or a small elite. And we expect this to become manifest into better economic growth, welfare improvements, reduction of corruption, and even the strengthening of state structures, a better functioning of the state. So we collected the data about how leaders have changed and how the modes of leadership changes have evolved, and now we want to see whether there's an impact on these different aspects of development. We might have chosen other aspects of development, but we focused on these four, and in particular I would say something about economic growth. we expect the impact of electoral incentives to be stronger under democratic conditions. But we expect there to be some incentives for Libre to achieve better development performance, even where you have elections short of democracy. Even say in Uganda or in the Congo, where you have elections not actually considered democratic, we expect that the leader that is sitting at the top says, well, hold on, I'm going through election next year or in a couple of years. I'm pretty sure I can control the process, but I want to help myself and I want to make sure I remain in power. I don't want to create a situation where there is pressures from below, electoral pressures, somehow to replace me. So let me do something good. Let me promote economic growth. Let me adopt new health measures or improve the education of this country or invest in infrastructures and so on. Also, we expect this kind of pressures to become stronger where elections are repeated every 4 or 5 years. You know, the more elections are repeated, the more leaders probably feel this kind of pressure. Also, the more competitive elections are, meaning that if there's a country where a leader typically wins by 75, 80%, with a 75 or 80% majority, it doesn't feel much of a pressure to behave and adopt strong policy choices. If he only won the last election with a 52-53 majority, he might think, well, I better work hard towards the next election because I'm not sure that I'm going to get this majority again. You know, my challenger was so close. And also we expect successions in office, meaning the arrival of a new leader from the same political party, to be a moment of political renewal that helps development. And the same goes for alternation in office, an opposition victory. So we carried out this analysis to try and see whether there's a connection between leadership dynamics and dimensions of development, and we looked at economic growth, welfare improvements, state strengthening, and fight against corruption. I'm only going to talk about economic growth here. And our hypotheses specifically were, first, that elected leaders have better development performances than non-elected ones. So we compared elected leaders to non-elected leaders to see whether there was a difference in their economic performances. And related to this, a sub-hypothesis that wanted to look specifically at democratically elected leaders. Leaders that were not simply elected under the multi-party conditions, but in a context of respect for democratic standards. Second, we wanted to see whether the repetition of elections improved government performances. So the cumulative elections. You know, maybe the impact of elections only comes after 3-4 elections because both leaders and voters learn how this game works. Third hypothesis, more competitive elections favor better performances. The example I was doing before. It is particularly those leaders who only won by little majorities that feel that they have to make their best effort to promote their country's development. Fourth hypothesis, leaders that come as new leaders out of the ruling party perform better than non-elected leaders and incumbent leaders that are confirmed in office. And also, finally, leaders that come from the opposition perform better. And as the more electoral alternations, the more victories from the opposition, the more you promote accountability and better economic performances. Is the logic of this clear? Please don't fall asleep. I know this has been long, and I'm going to conclude it in a few minutes. This is very much some details for the econometric analysis. Equation that we use, the dependent variables, I'm only talking now about economic growth. Essentially, we have been looking at the impact of those aspects that I say, elections, electoral successions, the repetition of elections, on economic growth. But we also did this by looking at aspects of social welfare, fight against corruption and state capacity, using measures of these other dimensions of development. These are our independent variables, explanatory variables, elected leaders, the number of elections, the aspects I've just mentioned, and the controls of things we want to make sure that do not interfere with the relationship that we're seeking to single out. We want to make sure that it is not a matter of investments coming from the outside that decides how strong is economic growth. We want to control for population growth. Maybe economic growth has nothing to do with the kind of leaders we have in place, but depends on the rates of population growth, or maybe on the degree of ethnic fractionalization that holds the country back, maybe, or the level of aid, development aid. So all these factors we also used in our economic analysis to try and clean our account of a relationship between leadership factors and development outputs. I think I really have to now statistical analysis that essentially tell us that most of our hypotheses are correct. And this is the summary with a simple yes or no for our hypothesis. This is what I've been talking about right now, the impact on economic growth. But as I said, we also examine corruption, social welfare measures, and state consolidation. Let us just focus on the first column. Economic growth. These are other hypotheses that I did not mention today, but we expect coup d'etat to have been deleterious to economic growth, and that proves correct, and other irregular takeovers, such as guerrilla takeovers, also to be deleterious, and those prove correct. We also expected leaders who have been in office for long to be deleterious, and that also proves correct. The idea that leaders gradually become more effective and then with time become deleterious did not prove correct. And here are the key hypotheses that we've been talking about. Elected leaders do perform better in terms of economic growth compared to unelected leaders. Democratic and elected leaders also, at least partly, this hypothesis is supported, prove stronger performance than unelected leaders and then elected leaders under non-democratic conditions. The number of elections, cumulative, the total number of elections, the repetition of elections, is also a positive factor. The number of democratic elections cumulated is also positive, has a positive influence. The number of competitiveness of the elections, that is the election results are, how limited the majority of an elected ruler is, also proves correct. The succession hypothesis, also the alternation hypothesis. You have the same yes and no way of summing up the results there. This is a very rough way of summing our results. But what the overall pictures tells you is that most of the reasoning that was in our hypothesis seems to be supported by the facts, by the data that we gathered. So when we run our statistic analysis, the results tell us that yes, most hypotheses are correct, but not all of them. somewhere you can see that there's a number of no, telling us that no, that hypothesis does not work, at least in terms of the measure that we've chosen. So there must be something else that explains the positive or negative performance of certain rulers. But again, overall, you can see that there's very many yes, meaning that most of our results support the idea that the new modes of leadership selection and replacement helped African development over the past 30 years. And so this is the very last slide, the conclusion. The analysis based on our new data set tell us first that we have a very different leadership dynamics starting in the 90s as opposed to what was there before. More elections, less coup d'etat, more alternations in office, and so on. Secondly, that leaders do matter for development. How they reach office influences how they behave, and thus influences how they favor or not development. It does not mean that a democratically elected leader or an elected leader will be a strong performer in terms of development. This is a general result for the region. There is a tendency for elected, particularly democratically elected leaders, to be better performers. But it's not just them who've done good. So elected leaders tend to outperform their unelected leaders, even where there is a situation which is not genuinely democratic, but performances are even better under democratic conditions. Because as Africa changed its rulers, as Africa embraced new institutions to regulate leadership dynamics, these leaders had themselves the incentives to help change Africa. What are the broader implications of these conclusions? First, I would say is that this challenges pessimism. It is often said that democratic progress in Africa has been very limited. Our results suggest that there is an impact on development even where democratic progress has been limited, but elections have been introduced. Elections have been introduced, but media freedom is limited by respect for individual freedoms, or for political equality, or for the rule of law, for freedom of association, and all other components of a democratic society are not well developed. Still, electoral processes can be supportive of development performances. And therefore they deserve being supported. These processes must be not abandoned, but supported. And the second implication is that since we are at a time when democracy is being challenged worldwide, of democratic reversal or backsliding or autocratization, countries even in Europe, say the case of Hungary, for example, or Poland, that are strongly criticized, they're sliding back gradually towards authoritarian practices. But also elsewhere in the world, with support from global powers such as China and Russia that are not particularly favorable to democracy. Africa so far has been spared somehow from this sliding back of democracy, but might not be spared in the future. And neither post-1990s democratic advances nor related development progresses are to be taken for granted. And this is one additional reason why electoral and democratic processes should be supported, because they do not simply have a positive impact in terms of freedom and equality, but also in terms of development outcomes. And I leave it here. I remind you that this book will be freely available and downloadable maybe next week or in the subsequent weeks from the website of ISPI for those of you who are interested in these topics. And there's the other book coming out in the next few months. Thank you. I can now take more questions if you want, but this has been.
North African countries are left out. Do they have any really better performances in terms of political leadership compared to other sub-Saharan African countries? So why did this project or study ignore these North African countries? So that's one question. And the other is, this data set, is it starting to inform policy and research practices? How accessible is it, this data set of yours? I think that's very important as well, because it has to be put to practical use and informing policies.
Or leaders and the developers should be changing or replaced for the obvious reason. But what is optimal number of years? Or terms that the leader should stay in office? 10 years, 20 years, 5 years? What that optimal number? The other one is, do you think there is one best political system for the economic development? Because you see, there are autocratic countries or undemocratic countries, but registering remarkable economic development. So, do you think your findings or conclusion comply with the literature that we have in the area? Thank you so much.
Leaders overstaying in office. And I think that for maturing democracies, that can be helpful. This is my personal view. Also, you rightly point to the fact that there are authoritarian leaders who have been doing well. We should not, we can mention two cases in point that are Rwanda and this country as well. Ethiopia is not considered a country that is very strong in terms of democratic progress not even in Africa, but it's very strong in terms of development achievements. And these two countries have been ruled by two leaders for most of the period under which strong development results were achieved. One is Meles, of course, and the other one is Paul Kagame in Rwanda. I think this is very important, and this is food for thought. There are certainly autocratic leaders that can be strong performers. However, one might mention a number of cases, Mobutu-like cases, who have been pretty much devastating in their countries. And my view on this is that Kagame and Meles have been extraordinary figures, out of the ordinary. And they promoted strong development achievements out of something that is not necessarily found in other individual leaders. So you might have the good chance in terms of development outcomes. I don't know, I guess there are different views of Meles' prime ministership, but certainly achieved a number of development results. You may have autocrats who do achieve these impressive results, but you cannot, in a sense, control them. If you're lucky, you get them. You're very likely to be unlucky, because there are very many autocrats who have no reason or little reason to promote good policies. So this is left somehow to the individuals, to the emerges by chance somehow, not just by chance, but to the occasional emergence of the likes of Meles or Kagame, and to the duration in power of these figures. Once the Meles kind of leader dies, or the Kagame kind is ousted, what are the best guarantees that you get a good enough leader? I think that institutional mechanisms can help, making sure that you produce reasonably good leaders, if you see what I mean. Somebody will turn up, will show up and say, I want to be the leader of this country, I want to grow, govern, help this country achieve development. If he has to go through an election, and if he knows that obtaining an electoral mandate and renewing his electoral mandate at a subsequent election has to do with what he is able to produce in terms of visible outcomes of his rule, visible, tangible development achievements. I think this is one of the best guarantees that you can push them in the right direction. It is not absolute guarantee, of course. There's plenty of people who win elections because they're good at talking at campaign rallies and are messy rulers. You know, at that point you might have a strong argument in saying, well, I want the Kagame type back. You know, he's very tough. You know, he's been accused of all sorts of things in terms of repression in his country. But he produced welfare for us Rwandans. I want that guy back. I don't mind other people who go win elections, go there, they are good at talking and they don't know how to rule a country and develop a country. So you may end up with bad leaders, but in terms of how to structure the polity in such a way that you're more likely to get better leaders, I think institutional
findings, the issue of, or the way to bring about democratic leadership in Africa. I'm asking this question for two reasons. Number one, there is a democratic system is fragile in Africa, obvious. Secondly, Africa is also a diverse continent. So in light of these two,
I'm sorry, so Africa is also?
A diverse continent. So in light of these two, and also the other aspect is that countries who have been considered as democratic in Western countries, particularly in Europe, are now reverting to right-wing inclinations. So they are calling snap elections. This is being seen in many of European countries. So, so long as African democracy is influenced by the Europeans who have historical stake, how much do you believe that democratic leadership can be a reality? That is one. The other one is, I think the omission of North Africa from this research is not cannot be explored in the sense that North African countries are now in transition since the Arab Spring, still now. They are also one family. They are under the European, African Union. So the omission may not justify that because they are historically different, because they are the family of European, African countries. The other one is the force of history, the so-called force of history. This study cannot have really a good conclusion in the sense that African leadership and development is highly linked to European or other Western countries. That is my last comment. Thank you very much.
End of election before 1990s and after 1990s, and found that multi-party election increased in 1990s. Leadership change became more often. Leaders' tenure stopped growing. cops down and elections up. These are some of things that we learned from that. My question is, these changes are very interesting. However, are these changes occurred because of internal forces or genuine internal change from the leadership, or there are some, say, external influence to bring such changes? This one question. Another one is, are you really surprised about your findings? Because it is established that democracy is very important and it has a positive relationship to development. It enhances development. So what's new here? Are your findings new from the first established facts? Thank you.
Theme that has been explored by political scientists and economists. I myself did some work on the relationship between democracy and development, democratic regimes, not leaderships, not specifically. You have seen how I was very much focused on individual leadership experiences. So not so much, for example, on Ghana, say, from 1992 until today as a democratic country, but on individual leadership experiences, Rawlings, Kufuor, and subsequent ones. We're trying to relate those experiences to development outcomes. For example, when we talk about succession or alternation. So our work is related to work that focuses on whether democratic as opposed to non-democratic regimes promote development. And it's not huge. It's only been explored over the past 10 years, I would say, mostly. It's related to that, but what we add to that is a more specific focus on individual leaders. So it's part of a growing corpus of analysis. Then you asked, or before that, you asked whether external factors brought about changes, such as the decline in coup d'etat and so on. Of course they did. It is not by chance that Africa embarked on adopting multi-party elections in the early 90s. No, the Berlin Wall fell in 1989 and the world changed. You mentioned before that during the 60s, 70s, and 80s, Western power, for example, supported African autocrats. That's pretty clear. And they mostly stopped that. No, that's incorrect. They changed that after 1989. After 1989, they were less interested in having a Mobutu in Congo or a Samuel Doe in Liberia as an ally in the region to counter Soviet influence. And they became more interested in promoting better governance. We may argue about that, but that's an interpretation of what went on. So from the outside, they contributed to moving Africa towards the adoption of multi-party democratic processes, and also delegitimized coup d'etat. But let me stress again that we're not focusing on what explained leadership changes. Or here again, you're pointing at external causes of the way leaders change today in Africa. The fact that coup went down, elections went up. We're not using an arrow in that way, but our causal factor is leadership changes, and it's from there that we have an arrow pointing at the consequences of that. So now that we know that coup have gone down and elections have gone up, our question is what happens in terms of development, and that's our focus. Moving to the questions, I can't remember, sorry, who asked that. The exclusion of North Africa. Yes, that was your question. I take your point. That's correct, but we didn't feel like doing that. I mean, to study something, you need to know, at least partly, the region you're talking about, and I know too little about North Africa. And as I say, there's a strong tradition to keeping that separate. That doesn't impede that anybody maybe even in this room, might want to use our data set to explore the extent to which what we found for Sub-Saharan Africa also applies to North Africa. You also say that North Africa is in transition. It is somehow in transition. I'm not convinced that they have made much democratic progress, except for Tunisia. When the Arab Spring took place in 2011, there was a lot of enthusiasm for that, and many people also pointed, particularly in Europe or in Italy, or international observers, saying, well, this might now influence what happens south of the Sahara. It's now blowing from the north, but it will touch sub-Saharan African countries. And my standard point there was that no, it's the other way around. North African countries are latecomers, not pioneers. That the reforms that North African countries have been trying to introduce, the room for open politics, that have been partly trying to introduce in 2011 and afterwards, although again, the progress was very limited, was something that African countries had already embarked upon 20 years before, in the 1990s. Also, you asked what should be done to bring about democracy in Africa. I think that one other thing that I don't like in the most common view about democratic progress in Africa is that it's pretty pessimistic and very often points to failures rather than successes. My view, ever since I began studying these processes of political change, renewal, and the introduction of electoral processes, and let's call it democratization in Sub-Saharan Africa, I've always been much more positive than the predominant view. And I don't want to hide that. I mean, I might be somehow over-positive or over-optimistic. But my starting point is that you don't create a democratic system or 49 democratic systems overnight. It's a long process. And Europe itself has been through ups and downs. We have phases and phases in countries that have been already developed substantial electoral practices, universal suffrage, electoral politics. In the early 19th century, in Germany, in Italy, in other countries, in France. And these systems collapsed during the First World War and the Second World War. And we had to rebuild them. So we had something akin to democratic systems before World War I. Then we had the horrible experience of fascist regimes, where whatever democracy we had matured was abandoned. And we had to start again. And other countries, think of Greece, that had a coup d'etat in 1967, or Spain, that only moved to democracy after Franco died, the dictator Franco died in 1975. While even Spain had democracy up until the 1930s. So developing a democratic system is a tough job. It takes time, and you may have moments when you have strong progress and moments when you have stopped. You see failures. It's a stop and go process very often, and it doesn't surprise me at all that African countries go through these stop and go processes ever since the 90s. It was wrong from some observers to expect that simply because elections had been introduced in the early 90s, African countries would democratize quickly and stably. No. Mali, for 20 years, was a reasonably well-functioning democracy. a very poor country, reasonably functioning democracy. And in 2000, was it 12 or 13? There was a coup d'état, and that was subverted. And then it started all over again with help from the outside and interference from the outside as well. But there was an interruption, a coup d'état, and a return to electoral politics. And that's the only way, not the coup d'état thing, but the stop and go process. That's the only way you can, the correct way, I think. You should look at African processes of democratization. It's been 25, 30 years, which is nothing in building democratic progress in so many countries. And it's bound to take time and suffering and mistakes and starting anew time and again. So that's my take on this. And finally, I think you said something about the particularity of individual countries and whether democracy should be thought of as a recipe that works the same.
Not actually, do you know now in Europe now, just now in Europe, there is a far right stance in which case snap elections are going on in Italy, in other areas as well. So, in light of this, because African
Number of people challenging democracy across the world. From Europe, think of Prime Minister Orban in Hungary. Think of populists across the region. In Turkey, think of Erdogan. In Brazil, think of Bolsonaro. Let alone the likes of Putin. People who have not genuine democracy at heart and think differently. And many of them are labeled populists or sovereignists because they tend to see democracy as a very narrow appeal to the support of the people, of the masses, with limited regard to all the other components. So democracy, it's not just made of elections. I've been talking about elections essentially, but democracy needs a lot of other things. You need independent judiciaries. You know the things. The courts must be independent. You cannot control the courts. The way people like Orban, for example, is doing in Hungary. Make sure that the judiciary responds to the executive. It passes laws that reduce the room for freedom for NGOs, independent organizations, for the media. And these are ways you kill, you suffocate democracy. And this is very bad for us in Europe as well as globally for those who believe that democracy is the best way forward. And that we should build and improve rather than reduce the room for democratic progress. There's a number of reasons why this is happening, and partly has to do with, I would say, inequalities within nations and among nations, and as well as with competing power games or trade power competition at the global level, with China and Russia contrasting the American view. But Trump himself is not necessarily, it's not in my view, certainly, having a positive impact, because it is a populist himself, not somebody who believes in the diversity of institutions and components of democracy. Again, he's a populist. Yes, so I think this would be my take on this.
Okay.
So there is two-way relationship between these two variables. So if there is two-way relationship, it affects the results because there is what we call it endogeneity in your estimation. Endogeneity, simultaneity, where there is two-way relationship between the variables. So this ultimately leads to endogeneity, which leads to a biased result. Is there any identification mechanisms that you have used in analyzing the effect of this political leadership on economic development?
These issues, there is a long-standing tradition in the so-called modernization studies that looked at how development brings about political changes and as the result of processes of economic development. So as I was answering before, looking at political change, democratization, or changes in political leadership dynamics as a factor that affects development is a more recent approach that I adopt, others have adopted. Yes, there's very many studies that have examined that and related democratic progress with modernization processes, and it's pretty much sound evidence that proves that there is a connection between the level of development, level of modernization, and the fact that democracy emerges and stabilizes, consolidates. I hope I answered your question, because I'm not sure I fully heard it.
Okay, discussion of the subject matter, and as well as the participant for your attention and participation. I will call upon now the Vice President for making a closing remark and providing the professor the appreciation certificate.
Yes, sir. And also thank you, the really diligent audience, for insightful questions and remarks being made by you. Well, I don't have any such closing remark, but I have to thank again the organizers of this seminar and linking pin of this resource person. And I cannot thank enough Professor for his insightful presentation, and the relationship could continue with us, not only on an individual basis, but we will try to make it institutional so that we can benefit from resources available from individual professor, seasoned intellectual, and a prolific researcher, and other colleagues, I think, remaining behind. And one thing that I have in my mind is, besides the research findings, besides the statistics, besides any narrative, we have to pray for God to give us leaders that live up to their promise. It was the same Museveni who said that the problem of Africa is long-staying leaders than those who make progresses in a reasonable time and leave the place for others. But he is, again, the one who wished to die on his presidency chair. He has just revised the term limit, but not satisfied with the change in term limits. And he again made a change on age limits so that he is going to die over there. And there are people wishing to come to power and remain there until they die. So God forbid. What I can say. This is my remark, and once again, I like to thank Professor. Well, we don't have anything to do with, but we have a heartfelt appreciation to the contribution he made, and here is the certificate of appreciation, Professor. Thank you indeed. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And would you please thank the audience for yourself, please. Have a blissful afternoon. Thank you very much.